Raiding is hard, and it's understandably very intimidating for a lot of newer players. With the final tier of Endwalker so soon on the horizon, a lot of people are going to be overwhelmed once again. All of a sudden a new patch drops, with 4 new raids, and a week later we're given access to all of the Savage raids straight out of the gate, where you're quickly expected to know the ins and outs of every single fight. One of the most common criticisms with raiding in general is the lack of mid-core content. It's pretty much either you're playing normal raids, which legitimately require very little gameplay investment whatsoever, or you're just jumping right into Savage raids, which require a very large amount of time, effort, skill, and practice. I wouldn't disagree that the difficulty curve is very intense for someone that simply wants to try out these high-end raids, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. I only really started actually raiding in Endwalker, and even then when Diabolos dropped, I only managed to clear P1S before getting discouraged and quitting. Fast forward a few months and I've cleared the entirety of Abysso Savage with some friends in Party Finder, and even had fun progging the newest ultimate on day 1. Raiding doesn't have to be stressful or exhausting or even hardcore to be successful. It's supposed to be fun. Now, I'm not here to teach you how to learn or study fight mechanics. I'm not making an encounter guide here. But what I will do is give you some advice to help keep yourself grounded and be successful regardless of your experience with Raid. For many new raiders, myself included, it can be very easy to look at all the various fights in the game that have been released over time and say, oh, I want to do this. I want to clear the hardest content in the entire game. I want to be an Ultimate Legend right now. And that's great. But you're not going to be able to just jump ship from normal content to an Ultimate Raid, or at least not without a lot of practice. Don't try to push your limits too hard, too fast, and don't be upset if you're not where you want to be. Raiding, like many other things, is a skill investment, and you won't always notice changes overnight. Pace yourself. Try starting with an older extreme and be happy with yourself when you clear it. Every little bit of practice and experience will add up and will pay off, so long as you give yourself the time for it to be able to. Too many people burn too bright and too fast in Raid and end up burning themselves out shortly after new Raid tier or ultimate drops. If you force things too hard, you will eventually not want to Raid anymore. And being in that state is one of the most crippling things you can actually do to your skill development. If you're starting to suffer from burnout and you know that you still want to Raid, take a break. Give yourself some time. I'm going to repeat this a lot throughout this video, but the fights aren't going anywhere. And just because an entire raid tier releases at the same time, doesn't mean you need to rush to get it all done. It's okay to take your time. This is straight up one of the most powerful things you can do to make yourself likely to clear a fight. Be patient. I would heavily recommend that you learn to be patient with yourself and the others that you are playing with. This is a skill that needs to be developed, and some people are going to be better at it than others. And honestly, yeah, it can be really easy to get frustrated with mistakes in environments like Party Finder sometimes. But mistakes like these will happen for as long as you raid. Human error is unavoidable, and you have to be okay with that. Your patience can be tested a lot during raid, and honestly, it will get to most of us more than we'd like to admit about ourselves. It's okay to have certain expectations, but again, be reasonable with them, and don't be unhappy if those expectations aren't met. A big part of developing patience is learning to be happy with the progress that you have made. Sure, maybe you didn't clear the fight today like you wanted to, but at least you did the hardest mechanic correctly. Things like that do matter, and if you focus on those things, no matter how small they are, you will eventually become more patient and more motivated. Now, all of this isn't to say that you shouldn't be allowed to be impatient or even feel negatively during raid. You're a human being with feelings, and eventually you will get frustrated or discouraged or upset, and that's completely fine. But negativity during raid will eventually get in the way of your progress, and it will have an impact on you and the others around you. The sooner that you're able to avoid having your patience tested, the less these mistakes will get in the way, and the better your experience and the experience of others will be. Learning from mistakes is one of the fastest ways to improve at just about anything. Now, this is something that I think many of us are at least aware of, so I'm going to offer some raid-specific examples here. When a wipe happens, try to ask yourself what went wrong. Recorded POVs or sifting through the combat log can help with this. If you can diagnose what happened to cause the wipe, you can generally figure out how to avoid it in the future. This is applicable for mistakes that you make, but also mistakes that other players make. Try to pay attention to their mistakes so that you don't repeat them. I've seen countless examples of wipes during prog where someone ends up typing out, "What happened?" And that's good. These are the kinds of questions that you should be asking yourself whenever a wipe happens and you don't know why. In a lot of ways, raid mechanics are just a set of instructions for players to follow. And if you're ever confused about any of the instructions, it is not unlikely that you will make a mistake. The more questions that you ask and are able to have answered, the less likely you are to make mistakes. Now, this might seem slightly counterintuitive to the last point that I made, but this section is more of a mindset shift as opposed to anything else. It is extremely common for players in a video game to blame their teammates instead of holding themselves accountable for mistakes. Besides just generally being very toxic, this is also very damaging to a player's personal growth. If somebody makes a mistake and wipes the raid and it isn't you, please, please, please do not flame them or go after them for their mistake. This is where developing patience becomes very powerful. Instead of blaming others for mistakes, even if it is their fault, try and focus on what you could have done differently. Sure, maybe you performed the mechanics correctly, but you dropped a melee GCD or overcapped your resource or something. Now, the goal of this isn't to put any pressure on yourself for not playing better, but rather to focus on the things that you can directly change in a raid. As much as we may try or think so, we cannot directly make our raid members play better in instance. We can only do that with ourselves. Instead of blaming others for making mistakes, be confident that you performed correctly, but also try and think of ways you could play even better. Nobody is playing completely optimally, and there is always something, however small, that you could be doing better. Again, the goal of this isn't to prevent yourself from feeling competent or good enough, but rather to give you things that you can continue to develop when the raid progress is slow. Generally speaking, you should always aim to play the job you like the most in a raid. You will naturally enjoy the environment more if you enjoy your job. Now, this is the kind of thing that could change in time, but at least as of right now, job balance is pretty healthy in the game, and there are 0 jobs that are not viable for raid. If Black Mage is the job that speaks to you, then play it. Who cares if it's harder, if it's the job that you want to play? Don't let other people pick your job for you. That being said, for those of you playing in a static, you may need to flex to a less comfortable role for the sake of your composition. Just make sure that you still enjoy the role you're playing, otherwise you will not have fun. In general, the more fun you have, the easier it will be to get better. And don't be afraid to try new things and push your comfort zone. Try healing an older EX that you know, or maybe give melee DPS a shot if you normally just tank. Learning how different roles function in a raid setting with your personal experience will give you a much better perspective on how all jobs function in raid as a whole. As a DPS player, I personally healed most of Abysso Savage, and it legitimately made me a far better player than I would have been if I just kept playing DPS. This is one of the most common raid group killers. Raid is very commonly taken far too seriously in Final Fantasy XIV. The higher up in difficulty you get, the higher the expectation of skill, and this makes sense and is generally pretty valid. A new raider shouldn't just join a P8S in Rage to Clear party, for example. At the end of the day though, Final Fantasy XIV is just a video game. It's not a life or death situation, and despite how some players may act, the raids aren't going anywhere. You have time to clear them. No amount of mental fatigue or exhaustion or emotional overload is worth clearing a fight. You can always come back to try again later when you or others are feeling better. Ultimately, most of what I'm suggesting with this video comes down to you, the individual. Regardless of what job you play or however long you've raided, mindset during raid is important for everybody. We alone are in charge of our emotions and feelings during raid, and our feelings and motivations have far more to do with our success than most of us realize. Anyone who has completed a raid tier or an ultimate raid will have stories about all the time and effort they've put in to get there. It doesn't just happen overnight. It's a journey, and it's also not something that's for everybody. Raiding is hard, it's challenging, and for many of us, will be a lot more stressful than we would have ever thought. But when you see yourself finally surviving that difficult encounter that you thought you'd never be able to do, it becomes worth it. When you learn to work together and succeed with others towards a common goal, when after all this time that shiny new savage weapon that you've always wanted finally drops, and when you're able to look back at where you started from and know, truly, beyond any question of a doubt, how far you've come since then. When asked the question, has your journey been good? Has it been worthwhile? Yeah, it's worth it. Well, there you go. So, to be honest, I've really wanted to put a video like this together for a long time now. Raid is something that's been very challenging for me. Not that that's terribly uncommon, but also very rewarding. I think the reputation that a lot of raiders have kind of puts off a lot of people from actually going in and trying it, but if you're able to get a group of friends, even if it's not a full group of 8, and go into some content and try and figure it out, it feels really, really good when you're actually able to get the clear. It's probably the closest you can actually feel in this game besides playing MSQ to legitimately feeling like an anime character, and as, you know, dumb as that may sound, it feels really good. And, you know, with the new tier on the horizon, just a couple of days from this recording, I thought it was a good idea to try and put something like this together. There's a lot of new people that are going to try out Savage, or try out the older Ultimates, and kind of catch up on all the stuff that they haven't done in Endwalker yet. This is presumably our last Savage patch of the entire expansion, so there's going to be a lot of downtime for people to get caught up with all the stuff that they want to do. And I think that's exciting, and I think it's something people should look forward to. Raiding is difficult, but that's kind of the point, and when you can actually work together with a group of friends or just people that you have good chemistry with, you can be really surprised at the stuff that you can do. It's legitimately very empowering. And yeah, it's something that I think more people should experience. Raid is a big part of this game, not just because the content is hard, but because it mimics the spirit of what the entirety of MSQ is all about. You know, pushing forward despite the odds and overcoming your limits. And maybe that sounds kind of cliche, but, you know, let's be honest. Final Fantasy is pretty cliche, and there's nothing wrong with that. So, with all that being said, thanks everybody for watching, and good luck to all of you with your raiding.